Okay, so towards the end of this week's parsha, the Psukim tell us of the story of Lot and his daughters. Right, so Lot runs away from Sdom as a family unit with his wife and his children. His wife has the misfortune of turning around to get a glance at the city on the way out, and Vatihin Tziv Melach, she becomes a pillar of salt. And Lot and his daughters escape into the mountainside. And it says that Lot's daughters become convinced that they're the only living people left in the world, and they have a mitzvah to repopulate the world, and they get their father to drink, and they have children with their father, right? So now the Psukim tell us that after they become pregnant and have children with their father, so there's an interesting nekuda to the story. It says, "V'taharan shnei b'nei Lot me'avian." They became pregnant from their father. V'atelet habechira, the older one gave birth to a son. V'tikrish Mayav. She called him Mayav. Hu avi Mayav ad hayan. Now Mayav means Mayav, from my father. The second one, V'atzihira gam hiyelda ben v'tikrish my ben ami. Hu avi b'nei and ben ami is again a son of my nation, a son of my father. So the daughters of Lot seemingly not only did not make an attempt to cover up the unique and somewhat abhorrent way that they became pregnant, they named the children like very clearly to show where they became where this came from. So I once read, it's in the beginning of Igros Moshe and Chelik Ches. If you want to look it up, you could see. In the beginning of Igros Moshe and Chelik Ches, there's like a little biography about Moshe. Chelik Ches was the first volume that was published after Moshe was nifter, like published posthumously by his family. There's like a little biographical sketch. And on page 15 of the Hakdama to Igros Moshe, there's a story that Moshe was fond of saying. Now, Moshe was pretty litvish. He didn't say over a lot of Rebbe Shemaisis. This was a story that he was fond of saying. He said as follows. He was a young Rav in the town of Luban, which is a little Russian village, the town of Luban. And he said he was, once sitting in his home, it was Parshas Chayesara, and he gets summoned to a sick man's deathbed. It seems there was a man in Luban who was afflicted with like a terribly rare illness, where his tongue became full of maggots and was like stretching and bloating, didn't fit in his mouth anymore, and he was dying a painful death from this bizarre illness that he had contracted. And he called the Rav, Moshe, to come, a younger Moshe. Moshe was in his 20s, low 20s, to come to his house and to, minister to him before he dies. And he told Moshe, you should know that I know why I'm dying. He says, why is that? He says, last week was Parshas Vayera, when the Torah tells us about Lot and his daughters. And I was sitting with my friends by Kiddush, and I commented, and I said, Lot's daughters, they were really disgusting. They're really depraved. I mean, it's one thing to trick your father, to seduce your father, but like to then go name your kids after it so the whole world could know. Like, what's wrong with these people? This is not okay. And he says, that night I went to sleep, and in my dream, Moshe used to say the story. In my dream, two old women who were dressed, beautifully, and their faces shone with like a certain purity, came to me in my dream, and they introduced themselves. They said, "We are the two daughters of Lot, and we're here to mun you for your disrespect." And I asked them, I said, what do you mean disrespect? I have a good point. Why did you name your children Maya, Amma? It doesn't make any sense. And they told me that we did this because we wanted people to know that there's no such a thing as having a child without a man. Because later on, generations later, there's going to be someone who's going to claim to have been born from nothing. And we wanted to set the record straight. There's no such a thing as immaculate conception. A baby comes from somewhere. And so we named them Ammon and Mayav. We could have covered up. No one knew. We were out, in the wilderness. We could have gotten away with it, and we sacrificed our covet, didn't get away with it, so that generations should know that the Bible already says there's no such a thing as immaculate conception. Now, he says, and they told him that because you spoke disrespectfully of us, you're going to become ill with something in your mouth, and you're going to die from it. And this man told Moshe that, I know this is why I'm sick, I know I'm going to die, and I wanted someone to know the story. And Moshe said that he died, and Moshe always felt, he used to say over the story to his family, he always felt that it had a ring of truth to it. Like, it made sense what the guy was telling him. The story, Moshe somehow felt the story like resonated with him. It made sense. Now, so here, you have an example of what I would call the prime example of Aveira Lishma, of someone doing an Aveira with the purest of intentions, ad kedei kach that they sacrificed their own kavod to highlight the Aveira that was done, so that it should be like well known what exactly transpired over here. So the daughters of Lot did something that on its face is very not acceptable, very aser. but it was something that they felt they had to do in the moment, and it was a mitzvah for them, and that's why they were considered, at least what we see from this dream, to be, heilige people. Now, Chazal spoke about the daughters of Lot and framed it much the same way. The Gemara in Nazir, in Daf Chav Gimel, says about the daughters of Lot. The pasuk says, Yesharim darke Hashem, tzadikim yelchu bay, paishlim yikashlu bay. Tzadikim will go on the path of Hashem, and paishlim will become tripped up by the path of Hashem. The Gemara says, what's the ultimate example of this? Mashal leLot ushtei b'naisav. The mashal is like Lot and his two daughters. Hein sheneschavnu l'shem mitzvah. They who intended to do a mitzvah by doing this. So tzadikim yelchu bay. V'hu sheneschavnu l'shem aveira, paishlim yikashlu bay. So the Chazal framed this story of Lot and his daughters as the ultimate Aveira that was done l'shem mitzvah, and therefore they're called tzadikim yelchu. They're called people who did the right thing. But his Lot, who was going along l'shem znus, he's called Paishim Yikashlu. Now the Gemara on Chav Gimel and Beis in Nazir finishes off this thought with a famous Maimar Chazal. It says as follows: Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Gedola Aveira l'shma mi mitzvah shalei l'shma. Aveira that's done l'shma, an Aveira that's done with the right intentions to cause a good outcome is more chashiv and more important than a mitzvah that's done shalei l'shma. That's what the Gemara says. Fine, that's the Gemara brings this, and the Gemara brings a few different mishalim of this idea. So here you have this concept, the Gemara in Nazir, based on the Psukim in this week's parasha, based on the story of Lot and his daughters, this concept of doing an Aveira Lishma. Now that means you do something that's lahedya us, or something that's against the halach of the Torah, but since you're doing it with intentions for a good outcome, some of that becomes mutter. Now, there's a lot of, so to speak, downsides of Aveira Lishma. So let me just talk about that for a second, the downsides, and then we'll go back and figure out what exactly the rationale of Aveira Lishma is. I don't know, I'm sure Del knows a little bit about it, but the history of Shabtai Tzvi and his movement. So, just Bekitzer Nimratz. Shabtai Tzvi was born in the mid-1600s, he dies in the late 1600s, what? What do you mean? We did?
I'm talking about the Sefer. The first time.
I spoke about it?
No, you spoke about a Sefer that came from one of his
Talmidim. Oh, yeah, you're right. Yeah, you're right. Okay, so we touched on him briefly, we'll touch on him in a little bit of a different context over here. So Shabtai Tzvi was the most famous Mashiach HaSheker, right? The most famous person who ever claimed to use Mashiach and was not authentic was Shabtai Tzvi. Now Shabtai Tzvi ends up being arrested by the Turkish government, by the Pasha, and he is offered the chance to either convert or to die. He makes a very quick calculation, and he becomes a Muslim. Shabtai Tzvi, at the end of his life, becomes a Muslim and lives in the lap of luxury in the Pasha's court, mostly because the Pasha wanted to keep him close by. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. Anybody who could be making trouble out in the countryside, you keep them close by.
So that's the perk for me, by the way.
Keep your enemies closer.
No, to
to become a Muslim.
Yeah.
So,
no, I mean if it's
it's interesting that a Muslim might not be considered your Hagla Yav. It's Machik Zushanim. Yeah, exactly. So it's Machik Zushanim. Very good.
So it could still be Mashiach.
Yeah. So then Shabtai Tzvi eventually dies. And after his death, there's a theology called that was built up around him of Aveira Lishma, where basically they said that Shabtai Tzvi, in order to be Matar of the whole world and to get to the highest heights of Kedusha, had to go all the way into the Tumah, to become a different religion, really dig down deep into the Tumah and then transform the Tumah into Kedusha, and that's the way that you become like the highest level. This was the theology that was developed around Shabtai Tzvi. He had some famous Talmidim, like Chaim Malach and Yehuda Chassid, and on a certain level, Shmuel Primo, a bunch of famous different Talmidim who advanced this theology that a tzaddik is supposed to go into the depth of bad in order to turn it into good. The ultimate Aveira Lishma, to turn terrible Aveiros into mitzvahs. Now, because this theology was part of Shabtai Tzvi's world, 40 years later after his death, there was a guy who was born in Galicia in Poland. His name was Jacob Frank. He became the head of a sect called the Frankists. Now, Jacob Frank was a Vilda kid who was not holding by learning anything. He was a troublemaker. He was a bully. He was a tough guy. We have a lot of things written about him. But at 12 years old, he discovered a deep, deep interest in Kabbalah. He became very, very interested in Kabbalah, and he started gobbling up any sefer, any topic of Kabbalah that he could get his hands on, he would read. Eventually, he hooks up with a guy named Mordechai Margolis, who was a closeted Shabtai Tzvi supporter, who takes him on a trip to Istanbul, to Turkey, where some of Shabtai Tzvi's old Talmidim, the Dunma sect, were living. and he becomes exposed to Bruchya, who's the head of the Dunma, and he starts becoming exposed to Shabsai Tzvi, and Shabsai Tzvi is dead already, but the Shabsai Tzvi is Talmidim, theology. Now when Bruchya dies, the head of the Dunma, Yaakov Frank, who was about 20 years old at the time, announces that Bruchya, who was a Gilgal of Shabsai Tzvi, was now an Isgalgal in him, and he's the new Shabsai Tzvi for the Dar. Now, it's a classic example of someone who, like, when he said it to people around him who knew him, they thought he was crazy. But if you take your show on the road and you go find people who don't know you, they could buy it. So in Turkey, where he said this, people would laugh at him and throw things at him and call him crazy. But he moves back to Poland, to a small village, and he starts selling this, and the Elam's gobbling it up. And he develops a big Hasidus, hundreds, thousands of families who surrounded him. Now, they took this, like, theology of Aver Lishma to new depraved levels. The story goes, it's not even polite table talk, I can't repeat all of it, but the story goes that him and his Hasidim gathered together for raucous parties with every type of entertainment that you can imagine.
DJs.
And yeah, exactly. Even like sushi and crazy things that they had by the parties, and eventually this came, the Rabbanim in Poland, in Galicia, got wind of what was going on. You come to me afterwards, I'll give you more details. Got wind of what was going on at the parties, the Aver Lishma that was being engaged in, and the Kehila in Brody, the Bezdin in Brody in Brud, put out a psak astering the sect of the Shabsayim, of the Frankistan, and putting them in Cherub. Now, it didn't have a happy ending because Jacob Frank and his Talmidim end up going to the bishop of Kamenetz Podolsk and convincing him that the Shas is what's corrupting the Jews. They only believe in the Zayar. Zayar is good, Shas is bad. And they end up having a trial between two sects of Jews, between the Frankistan and the Chachamim of the time, if Shas or Zayar is better. And ultimately 10,000 copies of Shas get burnt in Poland in 1756 or something. Now ultimately, this of course doesn't end well for Yaakov Frank either, because the bishop tells him, at the end of the court case, the bishop says, now it's time for you to come over and become a Catholic. And numbers range between 10,000 to 26,000 of Shapsei, of Yaakov Frank's, Hasidim and associates end up converting to Catholicism in the 1750s and 60s in Poland. So it's like an extended piece to the Shapsei Tzvi story, but again, that centers very strongly on the theology of Aver Lishma, of doing Averis like L'Shem Mitzvah, which is called being antinomian. Antinomian theology, to do Averis L'Shem Mitzvah, becomes like a very big centerpiece, a focal piece of Shapsei Tzvi theology.
How do you know what's an Avera?
Well, we have the Torah. I mean, these things were not gray area. These were.
If they're Lishma and they think that's the Torah, then maybe.
No, they're not confused that it's an Avera in the Torah. Avera Lishma means you take something that's a well documented Avera. The Torah said it's an Avera, but since you do it L'Shem Mitzvah, so they had this. So the theology was that in order to arrive at, he called it Das, at the truest understanding of Elikus and Shechina and Yiddishkeit, you have to go down to the deepest place of Avera and destruction, and that's where you pull it up from. Now, of course, that's a bankrupt theory. Then you become a Kaddish V'Torah. Then you become the most Kaddish that anybody could be. You become exposed to the highest levels of Kedusha. Now, this is a very problematic ideology for obvious reasons, because it makes it very easy to justify doing all sorts of terribly depraved things under the guise of the ultimate mitzvahs. Now, ad kedei kach, that when the Chassidim came on the scene, not too long after Jacob Frank, it's literally a few years later, many of the early Misnagdim were very, very suspect of the Chassidim, that it's another version of Aver Lishma. Chassidim didn't do anything like this, like Aver Lishma on this level, but Chassidim also had minor antinomian tendencies, like Siman Kriyish Ma'at Tefillah, other certain things, Shtiblach, eating in shul. They had like minor antinomian tendencies that triggered the Chachamim to say like, oh, here we go again, here's the next round. Much, much less. Chassidim became extremely Haredi, like Chassidim became extra cautious. Chassidim are shomer on every tiny minig that exists. Right? Chassidim became, there was a transformation. It's really a topic for itself to talk about the transformation of Chassidus over the first 100 years of Chassidus. But whatever it is, this became like a focal point. Another big talking point in the time when Chassidim came on the scene was, how does this fit with the Sugi of Aver Lishma? So, ad kedei kach, that one of the most famous people who comes out against Aver Lishma in the Poskim is Rav Chaim Volozhin. Rav Chaim Volozhin and Nefesh HaChaim in two different places, and in Keser Rosh, comes out strongly against the idea of a person doing Aver Lishma. We'll get to it. But so let's talk about the Sugi of Aver Lishma a little bit in context. The stories I'm sharing with you are just to showcase the perspective, meaning there's an idea of Aver Lishma, like the B'nai Sleit, which Chazal seem to laud and Chazal seem to put it on a pedestal and say, like, this is Gedei Aver Lishma, it's bigger than a mitzvah Shalei Lishma, it's an amazing thing. And then there's all these other words to the wise, these warnings to the wise that show you that doing an Aver Lishma could be a very terrible theology. So the Gemara says in Nazir that an Aver Lishma is as big as a mitzvah Shalei Lishma. So now what's the rationale? What's the lamdas of Aver Lishma? Is the lamdas of Aver Lishma that it's not an Avera because you're doing it l'shem mitzvah, so now it's not an Avera? Or is it like it's dechia when you do an Avera but l'shem mitzvah? So it's like l'mashal pikuach nefesh is derech kol Torah kula, right? You're allowed to be over anything. So in that case, you can tell me that it wasn't Chil Shabbos. It was Chil Shabbos, right? It's just as Chil Shabbos l'tzarech. You're allowed to do it. So is that what this is? Aver Lishma is like light starters. Of course it was nus. Of course it was not allowed. But hayosit l'tzarech it's deicha, or is it not even? Or is it not even anything? Is it not even an Aver b'chlal? So there's a very interesting tshuva from the Marik. Marik has a tshuva where it's another interesting shaila. The Marik shaila was like this. The Marik is one of the Gedolei Meshivim. His shaila is like this. He says a lady who was mizana under her husband b'ratzon. She did it on purpose, but she didn't know that it was aser. She knew that he would not be happy. She knew that there's no room in the marriage for this, but she didn't know that it's aser. So the shaila is, would it have a din of a shaygig and would she not be aser to her husband? That's the shaila the Marik gets asked. Now the Marik has this whole shtickle Torah where he says that being aware of the isser about it is not so important, and he has a shtickle Torah. But in there he brings this piece that I want to read you about Aver Lishma. He writes like this. He says, "V'teida." He says, "V'hine davar pashatu." It says it's a davar pashat to me. He says, "Yosim ibeis b'kochta." Mamash, the simplest thing. He says, "Ki Esther le'asas shom Esther." When Esther went to Achashverosh, she didn't do any Esther at all. V'lehoya b'davar afilu nidno davera. There's not even a nidno davera. Ela mitzvah rabba asasa she'etzila kol Yisrael. She did a tremendous mitzvah. Now Esther is another example of Aver Lishma. She went to with Achashverosh. He says not only was it not an Avera, it's not a nidno davera, it's a mitzvah. He calls it. It's a mitzvah rabba. He says. B'teida, I'll bring you a proof. The Kenu, he says. We know Chazal tell us that when Esther came to Achashverosh, then she had Ruach HaKodesh as she was walking in. Right, the pasuk Keli Keli Lama Zavtani that David Melch says in Tehillim, it's referring to Esther. She had this Ruach HaKodesh, Kedarshin and Hasam. Then he says, and we know Chazal tell us that Esther was one of the Shiva Nevi'is. She was one of the 7 Nevi'is. Sha'amdu Lam Yisrael. Shari Sharsal of Ruach HaKodesh Ba'isa Shah. So he says, it's not possible. It's not possible that Esther was zeicha to Ruach HaKodesh in that moment that she was doing an Avera, something that's not okay. It's pasha to me that she did a big mitzvah. This is what the Marik says. The Marik seems to be leaning very strongly on that side, that it's not pshat that it's an Avera that's permitted under certain circumstances. When a person is doing an Aver Lishma in a time when everything jives and it's all correct, it's a mitzvah. It's not an Aver at all, it's a mitzvah. Now this is the Marik's understanding of this. There's other Rishonim that have maybe other ways to learn this, that maybe it is an Aver that's just hotcha for this for the moment, but we're running out of time, so I just want to read you a Netziv for a second. I think this is a very important thing. The Netziv, so really Rav Chaim Volozhiner and the Ramchal, they say that the whole idea of doing an Aver Lishma is only Kedem Matan Torah. It's only al Pinavi Kedem Matan Torah. Meaning one of us can't come and say, I'm going to do an Aver Lishma because it's ultimately it's a good thing. You can't do anything like that. That was only when you had a Navi. It was only Kedem Matan Torah. Now that we have Torah and mitzvahs and everything's set, you have no ability to do this. This is Rav Chaim Volozhiner says very strongly, and he says he wants to take it out of your mind. It's a mistake that people think that everything's totally in your brain. If you're thinking good, it's good. If you're thinking bad, it's bad. It's not like that. He says there are things that are good, there are things that are bad. You're not allowed to do this. This is Rav Chaim Volozhiner says. Now, the Netziv, who I guess you could say is a drop more liberal about it and allows Aver Lishma, he says a very interesting nakuda that I think really, really structures the whole thing. He says it like this. I want to read you. It's in this week's parasha. He says, he says, if someone wants to do an Aver Lishma, he says, Yesh li zar harbe, you can't take any pleasure in it. I mean, you can't take a single iota of pleasure in the Aver that you're doing. Why? He says, it's not like you're doing a mitzvah. When you do a mitzvah, if you happen to enjoy it, you still get the mitzvah, right? It says over there, that makes sense. Mashenkin ba'aveira lishma, he says, why? Because by a mitzvah, you're ba'atzim doing a ma'aseh mitzvah. Rather you have some hana from it, okay, so you can enjoy the hana. It doesn't change the fact that you're doing a ma'aseh mitzvah. He says by an aveira, you're essentially doing an aveira. Now, if it's totally lishma and you have zero hana from it, so fine. So then the fact that it's an aveira lishma makes it justified. You're allowed to do an aveira lishma. But if you have even the tiniest amount of mixed, emotions or mixed hana or mixed motivations, then in that case it goes back to just being an aveira. It is ultimately underneath an aveira. It's not a mitzvah. So seemingly the Netziv does not learn like the Marik. He's learning more like Rav Chaim Volozhiner and the Ramchal, that it ultimately stays an aveira, and therefore it's mamash ahira asha that was only said in very specific circumstances. But he doesn't say you can't do it anymore. He just says that you have to know that you're mamish on the highest level, and there's zero, mixed messages over here. Otherwise, it's going to ultimately be an aveira. L'mashal, the Tiferes Yisrael in Avos in the second parak, Tiferes Yisrael writes, don't think that you could steal money to give tzedakah and say it's an aveira lishma. He uses that example. Tiferes Yisrael says, don't think you could steal money to give tzedakah and it's a mitzvah, because everybody knows when you steal the money, you also have hana of having money. You also buy a nice suit with it. So if you're going to give some tzedakah, that's not going to justify. First of all, he uses that as an example of saying this idea that your machshavas have to be extremely pure, meaning so it comes out that to do a mitzvah, your machshavas don't have to be that pure. You do a mitzvah even if you're very muddled and confused, and you have all sorts of mixed motivations. You're doing it a little bit for social pressure, a little bit because it's how you were raised, a little bit because you want to make Hashem happy. But it's fine. That's called shalei lishma. That's a mitzvah also. It's a ma'aseh mitzvah. Muddled intentions are okay. It's still called a ma'aseh mitzvah. Shalei lishma, bal lishma, it's a mitzvah. When it comes to aveira lishma, to do an aveira lishma with any tiny bit of muddled emotions is not allowed. Now, l'maaseh, these are all examples of tremendous aveiros, like znos or whatever. Small, I shouldn't call them smaller, but other more kilu, I guess smaller because they're not your harvayav, or other smaller aveiros there's different chuvas that. L'mashal, there's a tshuva, I forgot who it's a tshuva from, but of a kehila that made a takana that there's not to be any talking in shul. And they all signed on, no talking in shul. And then there was a guy who was disrespectful to the Rav, and the guy sitting near him in the seat made a big stink in shul. He started screaming and yelling and shouting and talking in shul. And so the guy who got yelled at was creative. He came in front of the bezdin of the kehila and he said, we made up not to talk in shul. We said anybody who talks in shul gets a knas. So this guy who yelled at me talked in shul, he should get a knas. He violated the takana. So I forgot who the tshuva is from, but the tshuva says, the Meishiv says, no, that's aveira lishma. The guy talking in shul to be meichav with the cover of the Rav, that's look.
There's hana involved.
that's aveira lishma. You're right. That's an interesting point. That's aveira lishma. Or there's a Ramah that talks about saying Moitzi Shemra on someone in order to save a city. Aveira lishma, meaning so you do find occurrences in the Paiskim where they talk about aveira lishma. So seemingly the consensus of the Paiskim was not like Rav Chaim Volozhiner and Ramchal, like halach l'maaseh. It's more like the Netziv, that aveira lishma could still exist, provided that a person could be completely certain that his intentions are absolutely pure, and then you could do an aveira lishma.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.